Debates often spark passionate exchanges, but no one at NYU could have anticipated the way this one would unfold, especially when Barron Trump left the entire room speechless. The story unfolds at New York University, NYU, a school known for its intense debate sessions. Barron Trump, despite being the son of a prominent public figure, slowly takes his seat at the back, his tall, composed figure unassuming, almost like he wanted to go unnoticed. The door creaked open as Mrs. Walter, a striking woman, walked in with a presence commanding the room. She turned to the board and swiftly wrote, "Stricter immigration policies. Security versus compassion." Turning back to the class, she said, "Today's topic is one that will surely ignite some passionate debates. Who wants to go first?" Barron Trump has never been the type to get involved in school conversations or intense debate sessions. He always focused solely on his studies, going unnoticed. Another student speaks first, a girl arguing passionately for compassionate policies, citing America's history as a land of immigrants. Mrs. Walters nods approvingly, her gaze encouraging. "Great start, Emily. Who's next?" Barron taps his desk lightly, a subtle habit that seems to indicate he's already formulating his next move. Finally, he stands, commanding attention without effort. "I'll go," he says, his voice steady and deliberate. Silence falls over the room as Barron Trump begins. "Let's talk about stricter immigration policies," he says, scanning the room. "I'd start by saying a nation's responsibility is first to its citizens, isn't it?" He turned to the class as if waiting to receive an answer, then continued. In a calm and measured tone, he addressed the complexities of immigration, stating, "Immigration not only opens doors to opportunities, but it also opens doors to potential threats." His voice carried a tone of concern, not about denying others the chance to live here, but about confronting the rising security and economic challenges. "These aren't hypothetical scenarios," he emphasized. "They're real issues that demand our attention." His words linger in the air, sparking mixed reactions. A few students nod in agreement, while others remain silent, their faces unreadable. Mrs. Walter's expression, however, tightens noticeably. She steps forward, her voice steady but edged with tension. "Barron Trump," she begins, "are you implying that every immigrant is a potential criminal? Should we judge people based on their accent, skin color, or religion?" Her tone sharpens as she shares her own story, how she came to this country as a child with her parents and faced the looming threat of deportation due to policies similar to those Barron now advocates. The class shifts uncomfortably, the tension palpable. Mrs. Walter, rarely one to challenge a student so directly, speaks with an uncharacteristic edge that makes the room feel smaller, the air heavier. "Have you considered humanity? For people? For people like me?" Mrs. Walter's face softened for a moment, but her eyes glistened as she took a shaky breath. Her voice wavered, betraying the emotions she tried to hold back. "Barron, policies like these don't just break borders, they break families." The room fell silent. The weight of her words pressed heavily on everyone. Barron Trump, caught off guard by her deeply personal response, felt a lump rise in his throat. For a moment, Barron hesitated, unsure of how to reply to such a heartfelt plea. He could feel the weight of Mrs. Walter's words, and his own thoughts felt tangled in his chest. Drawing in a steadying breath, he finally spoke, his voice quieter but resolute. "Mrs. Walters," he began, pausing as if the words were carefully weighing themselves. I'm truly sorry for your pain." He looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts before continuing. He understood the profound value of humanity, a lesson his parents had instilled in him since childhood. For a moment he hesitated, the weight of his next words visibly heavy. "It's not about disregarding families like yours," he said, his voice tinged with sincerity. "It's about protecting all families. We have to find a balance, compassion alongside security, ensuring the safety of those who are already here while staying true to our values." He politely requested to review the latest statistics, which revealed a recent rise in crime and terrorism. The striking data left the class in stunned silence. A few students whispered among themselves, questioning how they could protect others if they couldn't ensure their own safety. Some nodded in agreement with Barron's point. He then continued, his tone firm yet thoughtful. Immigration shouldn't just be about opening doors. It should be about protecting those here, ensuring safety, thriving families, and sufficient resources. Barron Trump met Mrs. Walters' gaze, his expression softening as he weighed his words carefully. He didn't want to dismiss her experiences. The struggles she had faced were real and deeply personal. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore what he saw as a larger responsibility. I don't want to dismiss what you went through, but don't we have a responsibility to make sure we don't overextend ourselves to the point where no one is truly protected? It wasn't about disregarding anyone's story. It was about ensuring a future where safety and security weren't sacrificed for the sake of good intentions. He wanted to say more, but the weight of the words felt heavier with every second. His brow furrowed, and for a moment he wondered if he'd ever find the right way to explain. The tension in the room grew thicker. Barron's classmates exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others frowning as they processed his words. Mrs. Walters' eyes flickered with a mix of emotions. "You're asking us to draw a line," she said faintly. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips, knowing fully well the heat of the debate had just begun. It wasn't a surprise that she was trying to tackle Barron. Mrs. Walters is known for her liberal views. She's quick to dismiss any argument that doesn't suit her belief, but let's see how this turns out. Who needs help and who doesn't? That's a hard thing to decide, Barron. Humanity doesn't fit neatly into rules and policies, she said. I know, Barron admitted, his voice softer now. But maybe the hardest decisions are the ones that matter most. Barron's tone grew sharper as he addressed the room, his words cutting through the tension. He questioned the one-sided narrative of immigrants as victims, highlighting those who exploit the system, the criminals, the abusers, the ones who drain resources meant for citizens in need. Protecting the system, he argued, was essential to ensuring it served those it was truly meant to help. The class murmured in response, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged uneasy glances. The air grew heavier as Mrs. Walters stepped forward, her expression firm. "Barron Trump," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "You just don't get it, do you?" Her voice quivered as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She wasn't just talking about policies, she was talking about people, real people with dreams, families, and futures they were trying to build. Do you understand what it feels like to be told you don't belong, simply because of where you come from? Barron sighed, running a hand through his hair. He shifted his gaze to meet hers, his frustration building. So, what's the answer then? Open borders? Chaos? He asked. No, she replied firmly. The answer is compassion. It's about creating a system that sees people, not just problems. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with tension. Mrs. Walters' hands rested on the edge of her desk, her fingers gripping it as if grounding herself. Barron's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing. A sudden rustle of movement broke the moment. A student near the back stood, raising a hand hesitantly. Mrs. Walters?" The young man's voice was cautious but curious, breaking the intensity like a splash of cool water. "Can I ask something?" "Sure," she said, her voice steadier. She turned her attention to the student, giving the floor to the new question. The student hesitated, glancing around the room as if gauging whether he was treading on dangerous ground. "My question is for Barron," a student said, his voice steady but pointed. "You talk about protecting the system, but isn't the system supposed to protect people? At what point do the rules we follow start breaking the very people they're meant to help?" Barron's eyes flickered, the question hitting him harder than he expected. His voice came out slower, more deliberate, as if he were weighing each word carefully. "Isn't the system supposed to protect people?" he repeated, almost testing the words. He paused, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "You're right," he continued, his tone firming. "The system is meant to protect people, but it needs rules and structure to prevent chaos. Compassion must be balanced with caution to avoid risks. We build these structures with good intentions, but sometimes we forget who they're really for." He scanned the room, his gaze unwavering before speaking. "Maybe it's time we start questioning what protecting the system really means." He wanted to ask, should we preserve the system at all costs, even if some are crushed under its weight? Or is it about building something that truly serves everyone? He ran a hand through his hair, his voice now carrying a firm edge. If the system needs fixing, we fix it, but we must ensure it protects everyone. His message was clear. Policies shouldn't crush people. They're there to prevent chaos. And if we prioritize feelings over security, how can we guarantee we're not putting others at risk? So, yes, the system should protect people, but the only way it can do that is if we protect the system. The silence that followed Barron's words stretched on. Mrs. Walters' eyes narrowed as she leaned back, a sharp smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "So, Barron," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "are you telling me that compassion is a luxury we can't afford because it might make us vulnerable? Is that the security you're offering? A system that closes its doors on the very people it's meant to protect?" Mrs. Walters walked to the front of the class, her eyes scanning the room as if waiting for someone to challenge her question. She glanced at Barron Trump, who remained silent, and let out a knowing laugh as if the tables had suddenly turned. All eyes shifted to Barron, the weight of Mrs. Walters' pointed questions pressing down on the room. He felt the tension pressing against him, however. He cleared his throat and straightened up, refusing to let the unease show for long. "With all due respect, Mrs. Walters, would you risk an entire community's safety on the chance that everyone has good intentions? History shows us that bad actors only need open doors to act. Isn't prevention better than regret?" he asked. The room remained silent, the tension mounting as Mrs. Walters appeared momentarily taken aback. He continued, "What I'm suggesting isn't profiling. It's about acknowledging that any open system can and will be exploited if we're not vigilant." Mrs. Walters didn't immediately respond to Barron's point. Instead, she stood silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the floor as though searching for the right words. When she finally looked up, her voice was softer, but brimming with emotion. When she was 10, her family fled a war-torn country, seeking refuge in a place that promised safety, but the system they encountered wasn't designed to help people like them. "We waited for weeks," she recalled, her voice quiet. "Weeks in a crowded processing center, with no end in sight. My little brother got so sick because there wasn't enough food or clean water." She paused, her eyes distant as she relived those moments. "I remember my mother crying every night, whispering, 'What if they send us back?'" Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. "We didn't make it through because of the system. We made it through because someone saw us, heard our cries, and showed us compassion. Without that act of kindness," she added softly, "I wouldn't be here today, standing in front of you." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "So, forgive me if I find it hard to believe in your foresight, Barron. Sometimes rules aren't protection. They're barriers. And sometimes those barriers destroy lives." The classroom was silent, the weight of her story hanging heavy in the air. They had never heard Mrs. Walters opened up so much about her personal life, and it left them stunned. A few students exchanged hesitant glances, unsure how to process the raw vulnerability they had just witnessed. Even Barron seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his poised posture faltering as he struggled to respond. For a moment, it wasn't a debate anymore. It was personal and tensionable. Barron Trump shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry for what you went through, Mrs. Walters," he said, his voice low but firm. "I really am. But personal stories don't change the fact that systems need structure to function." He spoke of the 2015 European migration crisis, where some countries opened their borders without adequate safeguards. "It wasn't just refugees," he said, his voice low. "Criminals, human traffickers, smugglers, even terrorists slipped through. He paused, meeting their eyes. "I'm not saying compassion doesn't matter," he continued, "but it needs boundaries. When a system fails, it doesn't just harm those it's meant to protect, it endangers everyone." Mrs. Walters stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her tone sharp. "In the course of creating boundaries, Barron, remember that many families like mine can get left behind, and there's no humanity in that." The tension in the room was electric, the students frozen, unsure of where the conversation would go next. A hand shot up from the back of the room. "But doesn't this whole argument miss something important?" the student asked, his voice steady. "We're talking about compassion, policy, and safety, but isn't there a bigger reason people risk everything to come here? Poverty, war, desperation? Shouldn't that change how we think about who gets in and why?" The room went quiet as the student's question lingered in the air. Barron hesitated, his confidence slipping as he processed the challenge. Mrs. Walters raised an eyebrow, a subtle shift in her demeanor as she acknowledged the weight of his words. The other students exchanged glances, sensing the deepening of the conversation. As the silence stretched, another student stood up. Her voice was calm but firm. "I think the real issue is how we balance empathy with practicality," she said. Barron nodded, his tone deliberate. "It's not just about letting people in," he said. "It's about making sure the system works for everyone, including those who are already here." After a brief pause, Barron straightened up, his voice firm but reflective. I get it, I really do, but our system is fragile. If we open the gates, there's no going back. What if that's what breaks everything we've built?" Mrs. Walters' eyes narrowed slightly, but instead of responding sharply, she softened, her gaze thoughtful. She paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "And what would you suggest, Barron? That we close the door completely to those in need?" Barron hesitated, the weight of her challenge sinking in. "No," he said, choosing his words with care. "We need a system that balances compassion with responsibility, a way to help those in need, but not at the expense of those already here." Mrs. Walters gave a subtle nod, her expression shifting, reflecting a quiet respect. There was a brief silence, the room feeling heavier with the complexity of the discussion. Mrs. Walters straightened, her voice softer now, with a hint of something unexpected. "I appreciate your courage, Barron," she said, her tone genuine. "Not many would speak up so freely, especially when the stakes are this high. It's not easy, but it's important." The air in the room had shifted again. What had begun as a debate had grown into something deeper, an exchange of ideas that transcended mere argument. The students exchanged glances, their expressions mixed, some pensive, others uncertain. But for a moment the conversation hung in the air, not easily dismissed or concluded. And as the bell rang, the questions lingered, unanswered. The room buzzed with the quiet hum of thought, each student carrying something heavier than they had walked in with. A sense that the conversation wasn't over, that it would echo beyond this moment. If this debate got you thinking, you won't want to miss what's next. Click on the video on your screen now for another powerful story that will challenge your perspective and leave you inspired. Your next journey is just one click away.